July 8, 1946, 15:20 hours. A construction site in Dagenham, Essex. Jean Harper stood in the rain, watching men assemble what would become her family's home. The structure rising before her looked nothing like the houses she'd known. Not brick and mortar, built over months, but aluminum panels and steel frames being bolted together with industrial efficiency that seemed more appropriate for aircraft than dwellings. The walls were curved metal sheets. The roof was some kind of asbestos material. The windows were already glazed, delivered as complete units that slotted into pre-cut openings. The whole thing had an oddly temporary appearance, like a caravan that had been stretched and squared off, like military equipment adapted for civilian use, which Jean supposed it essentially was. The prefabricated house, prefab as everyone called them, had been designed using wartime manufacturing techniques and materials originally intended for aircraft factories and military structures. The government had promised housing quickly, and this was what quick looked like. Standardized units produced in factories and assembled on-site in days rather than the months traditional construction required. Behind Jean, her two children stood under a shared umbrella, watching with 7-year-old curiosity and 5-year-old impatience. Their father had been killed in Normandy. Their previous home in East London had been destroyed by a V-2 rocket in December 1944. They'd spent 18 months living with Jean's mother in a 2-bedroom house that was never designed for 7 people. This prefab, for all its strangeness, represented independence regained, family life restored, future possibilities after 2 years of grief and crowding and waiting for circumstances to improve. The foreman approached, checking something on his clipboard. "Should be ready for occupation by Friday, Mrs. Harper. Electric will be connected Thursday. Gas on Friday morning. You'll have running water, indoor toilet, fitted kitchen, all the modern conveniences." John nodded, still uncertain whether to be grateful or skeptical. The house looked like it should last maybe 5 years before falling apart. The government claimed 10-year lifespan, after which proper houses would be built and prefabs demolished. But 10 years seemed optimistic for structure that looked like it might blow away in strong wind. Still, it was a home, and her children would have their own bedrooms for the first time since the rocket. That mattered more than architectural doubts. "Friday then," she said. "We'll be ready." The mathematics of catastrophe. Britain's housing crisis in 1945 resulted from arithmetic that was simple but devastating. Millions of homes destroyed or damaged, minimal capacity to rebuild them, and urgent need for immediate solutions. The bombing campaigns Germany had waged against British cities from 1940 through 1945 had destroyed approximately 200,000 homes completely and damaged another 3 million, seriously enough to require major repairs before they could be safely occupied. London alone had lost over 100,000 homes. Coventry, Plymouth, Bristol, Southampton, Hull, every major city bore scars from bombing that made thousands of families homeless. But physical destruction was only part of the crisis. Britain's construction industry had been disrupted by 6 years of total war. Skilled workers had been conscripted for military service. Building materials had been diverted to military production and fortification construction. The industrial capacity that might have produced bricks and timber and all the components of traditional housing had instead produced tanks and aircraft and ammunition. Now that capacity was slowly converting back to civilian production, but the process would take years, during which housing shortage would worsen as soldiers returned home, formed new families, and needed places to live. The demographic pressure was substantial. Approximately 5 million British service members were being demobilized between 1945 and 1947, returning to civilian life and needing housing. Many were marrying. Wartime relationships that had been delayed could now proceed, and post-war optimism encouraged family formation. The result was surge in household formation at precisely the moment when housing stock was at historic low and construction capacity remained limited. Traditional construction methods couldn't address the crisis with adequate speed. Building houses from brick and mortar required skilled masons, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, tradespeople who were scarce and whose services were needed for industrial reconstruction as well as housing. Each house took months to build. Britain needed hundreds of thousands of homes immediately, not gradually, over decades. The government's solution was prefabricated construction. Houses built in factories using mass production techniques developed during wartime, then transported to sites and assembled rapidly. Winston Churchill had promoted the concept during the war, recognizing that post-war housing would require innovative approaches. The program aimed to produce 500,000 prefabs within a few years, providing immediate housing while traditional construction gradually addressed longer-term needs. The factory line. Prefab production represented application of wartime manufacturing efficiency to civilian housing, treating homes as products to be manufactured rather than structures to be built. Multiple designs were developed, each using different materials and construction methods but sharing common philosophy. Standardize everything possible. Manufacture components in factories. Minimize on-site construction. The most common design was the aluminium temporary bungalow, essentially a single-story dwelling with 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen, and bathroom, all prefabricated and designed for rapid assembly. The manufacturing process was remarkably efficient. Factories that had produced aircraft fuselages now stamped out aluminum wall panels. Plants that had made military vehicles produced steel frames for prefab structures. Companies that had manufactured components for tanks turned to producing fitted kitchens and bathrooms. The same mass production techniques that had built bombers and fighters were applied to creating homes, achieving economies of scale that made prefabs economically viable despite their seemingly wasteful use of materials. Each prefab was designed to be transported by truck and assembled by relatively unskilled labor in under a week. The components fit together with minimal cutting or adjustment. Electrical systems were pre-wired. Plumbing was pre-fitted. Interior walls came with insulation already installed. The assembly process required mainly bolting components together according to detailed instructions, more like assembling furniture than traditional construction. The speed was remarkable compared to traditional building. A skilled crew could complete a prefab from foundation to occupation in 5 to 7 days. Entire estates of prefabs could rise in weeks, transforming empty fields into functioning neighborhoods, while traditional brick houses were still being designed. Between 1945 and 1949, British factories produced approximately 156,000 prefabs, housed them throughout Britain, providing immediate accommodation for hundreds of thousands of people who desperately needed it. The first occupants. Jean Harper and her children moved into their Dagenham prefab on July 12, 1946, carrying their possessions in cardboard boxes and worn suitcases. The interior surprised her. It was actually quite pleasant. The kitchen was fitted with cabinets and a gas cooker, more modern than what she'd had in her destroyed house. The bathroom had actual bathtub with hot water, luxury that many working-class homes lacked. Each bedroom was small but adequate, with built-in wardrobes that maximized limited space. The living room had large windows that admitted substantial light, making the space feel less confined than its modest dimensions suggested. The children were delighted. They ran from room to room, claiming bedrooms, investigating cupboards, marveling at bathroom that was inside the house rather than in backyard shed. Their excitement was infectious, making Jean's own uncertainties seem less important. This was their home. It might be made of aluminum instead of brick, might be temporary instead of permanent, but it was clean and dry and theirs. The first night was strange. The walls made odd creaking noises as metal expanded and contracted with temperature changes. Rain on the aluminum roof was remarkably loud, almost deafening compared to tile roofs on brick houses. The heating system, a combination of coal fire in living room and small electric heaters in bedrooms, struggled to warm the space adequately, the metal walls conducting heat away almost as fast as it was generated. Jean lay awake, listening to unfamiliar sounds, wondering if she'd made mistake accepting this aluminum box instead of waiting for proper house. But morning brought different perspective. The kitchen was genuinely convenient. Everything arranged efficiently, hot water readily available, proper counter space for food preparation. Her daughter helped make breakfast, delighted with the novelty of their own kitchen after months of sharing grandmother's facilities. Her son played in the small garden that came with the prefab, already planning where he'd plant vegetables. By the time Jean had finished unpacking and arranging their possessions, the prefab felt less alien and more like actual home. The prefab communities. Prefabs were typically clustered in estates, rather than scattered individually, creating communities that were simultaneously new and deeply connected. The Dagenham estate, where Jean's prefab stood, contained approximately 200 units arranged in neat rows with small gardens and shared amenities. Her neighbors were mostly families in similar situations: war widows, returned soldiers with young families, people who'd been bombed out and spent years in temporary accommodation. Everyone was starting over, rebuilding lives from foundations of loss and disruption. That shared experience created immediate connection. Within weeks, the estate had developed social structures that transformed it from collection of aluminum boxes into actual community. Women formed informal support networks, watching each other's children, sharing rations when someone ran short, providing company and assistance with daily challenges. Men organized work parties to improve common areas, building playgrounds from scrap materials, establishing vegetable allotments that supplemented limited food supplies still governed by rationing. Children formed packs that roamed the estate with freedom that would seem remarkable to later generations. They played in the spaces between prefabs, invented elaborate games using the structures as props, created childhood world that was simultaneously constrained by post-war austerity and liberated by community safety that allowed unsupervised roaming. Jean's children came home filthy and happy each evening, having spent days exploring and playing with dozen other children whose families lived in identical aluminum houses. The physical similarity of all prefabs created unusual social equality. In traditional working-class neighborhoods, houses varied, some larger, some better maintained, creating visible hierarchies of status and success. But prefabs were identical. Jean's house looked exactly like her neighbor's, contained the same features, required the same maintenance. The uniformity eliminated certain status markers, making communities more egalitarian than traditional neighborhoods where housing quality reflected economic position. This equality extended to amenities. Every prefab had indoor plumbing, fitted kitchen, adequate heating, features that had been luxuries in many pre-war working-class homes. Women who'd never had hot running water in their previous houses marveled at convenience of taps that produced hot water immediately. Families who'd shared outdoor toilets with multiple neighbors appreciated privacy of bathrooms inside their own homes. The prefabs might be temporary and aluminum, but they provided living standards that exceeded what many residents had known before the war. The unexpected permanence. Prefabs had been designed as temporary accommodation, expected to last 10 years before being demolished and replaced with traditional housing. Reality proved different. The intended 10-year lifespan assumed that Britain's construction industry would recover quickly, that traditional housing would be built rapidly enough to replace prefabs on schedule, that economic recovery would provide resources for major building programs. None of these assumptions held entirely true. Construction capacity recovered more slowly than optimists had hoped. Economic austerity persisted through the late 1940s and early 1950s. Traditional housing construction, while substantial, couldn't keep pace with demand created by continued population growth and household formation. Meanwhile, the prefabs themselves proved more durable than their temporary designation suggested. The aluminum construction resisted decay better than expected. Proper maintenance, painting, rust treatment, repair of worn components extended lifespans significantly. Residents who'd personalized their prefabs, who'd invested time and effort in making them comfortable, resisted relocation even when alternative housing became available. The prefabs that were supposed to disappear after 10 years remained standing after 15, then 20, then longer. Jean Harper was among many who chose to stay when offered transfer to newly built council housing in 1956. She'd lived in the prefab for 10 years by then, had raised her children there, had established life and community she was reluctant to abandon. The new housing was larger and more solidly built, but it would also mean leaving neighbors who'd become friends, disrupting children who'd grown up in the estate, surrendering home that had served adequately despite its aluminum walls and temporary origins. By 1960, approximately 80,000 prefabs remained occupied throughout Britain, well past their intended lifespan. By 1970, 40,000 still housed families who'd either chosen to stay or had no alternative housing available. Some prefabs survived into the 1980s and a very few into the 21st century. Temporary structures that had become permanent through combination of durability, resident attachment, and failure of replacement housing to materialize as quickly as planners had intended. The children's memories. For generation of British children who grew up in prefabs, the experience shaped memories and identities in ways that persisted long after the aluminum houses were demolished. Margaret Wilson, Jean Harper's daughter, remembered her prefab childhood with mixture of affection and clear-eyed recognition of limitations. The house had been cold in winter, despite their best heating efforts. She recalled mornings when frost formed on inside of bedroom windows, when getting dressed required brief agony of leaving warm bed for frigid air. Summer brought opposite problem. Aluminum walls turned prefab into oven, making sleep difficult during heat waves. But she also remembered the community, the freedom to roam with other prefab children, the security of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone and looked after each other's children as matter of course. She remembered her mother's fitted kitchen, considered miraculous luxury compared to grandmother's pre-war arrangements. She remembered small garden where they grew vegetables, supplementing rations with produce they'd planted and tended themselves. The prefab had been home through her entire childhood and adolescence. She'd learned to read in its living room, had teenage arguments with her mother in its kitchen, had brought boyfriends to meet family in its cramped but welcoming space. When she finally moved out to marry in 1964, the prefab had been her home for 18 years, far exceeding its designed decade of service, outlasting what planners had intended, remaining standing through combination of maintenance, necessity, and her mother's determination to stay in place that had served family adequately. Many children of prefab families carried similar memories: the cold, the noise of rain on metal roofs, the distinctive smell of aluminum walls heated by sun, the tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone. These memories became markers of generation, shared experiences that connected people who'd grown up in prefab estates across Britain. Saying, "I grew up in a prefab," conveyed information about class background, about post-war childhood, about specific type of community experience that was simultaneously working class and oddly egalitarian, materially constrained but socially rich. The gradual decline. By the 1970s and 1980s, most prefabs were finally being demolished and replaced, their long service ending as Britain's housing stock gradually improved. The aluminum was corroding despite maintenance efforts. Asbestos in roofs and insulation was being recognized as health hazard requiring removal or remediation. Electrical systems needed updating to modern standards. The prefabs had lasted far longer than intended, but they couldn't last forever. Local authorities began systematic demolition programs, relocating remaining residents to modern housing and clearing prefab estates for redevelopment. Jean Harper resisted relocation until 1978, when her prefab's condition made staying untenable. The aluminum walls had corroded in several places. The roof leaked. Electrical system was deemed unsafe. At 71 years old, she accepted transfer to ground floor flat in nearby council estate. She moved with mixture of relief and sadness, recognizing that prefab had served its purpose, but grieving loss of home, where she'd lived for 32 years, 3 times its intended lifespan, encompassing her entire post-war life. The demolition proceeded efficiently. Prefabs that had taken days to assemble took hours to dismantle. The aluminum was scrapped, the foundations removed, the land cleared for redevelopment. Within months, the Dagenham estate where Jean had lived disappeared, replaced by traditional brick housing that was solid and permanent in ways the prefabs had never been. But the replacements lacked certain qualities: the sense of community, the social equality of identical housing, the memories of generation that had grown up in aluminum boxes that became homes through inhabitation rather than through architectural quality. A few prefabs survived as curiosities or historical artifacts, preserved by local authorities or by residents who purchased them and maintained them beyond all reasonable lifespan. These survivors became tourist attractions, museums, reminders of era when Britain had addressed housing crisis through innovation and improvisation, when temporary had become permanent through necessity and attachment. The unglamorous legacy prefabs occupy odd place in British post-war memory, simultaneously embarrassing reminder of austerity and nostalgic symbol of community resilience. The embarrassment comes from what prefabs represented about Britain's post-war condition, a nation so depleted by war that it couldn't house its people properly, that had to resort to factory-built aluminum boxes as stopgap measure, that accepted temporary solutions that persisted for decades because permanent solutions were too expensive or difficult. Prefabs were visible evidence of decline, of reduced circumstances, of Britain struggling to maintain living standards while recovering from war's costs. But nostalgia comes from what prefabs actually provided: immediate relief from housing crisis, communities where families supported each other, homes where children grew up safely and happily despite material limitations. The people who lived in prefabs generally remember them fondly, acknowledging drawbacks while appreciating what the structures enabled. The prefabs were cold and small and made of aluminum, but they were also homes where families were raised, where communities formed, where life continued and improved despite difficult circumstances. This duality reflects broader truth about Britain's post-war experience. The nation had won the war, but emerged exhausted and depleted, facing years of austerity and limitation. Solutions were often imperfect, stopgaps that persisted because better options weren't available. But people made these solutions work through determination and mutual support, creating lives that were meaningful even when materially constrained. The prefabs, temporary houses that lasted decades, aluminum boxes that became beloved homes, stopgap measures that raised entire generation, embodied this post-war British experience. They weren't triumph or disaster, but something between practical response to urgent need, achieved through innovation and compromise, succeeding well enough to matter while falling short of ideal. That was Britain rebuilding itself after war. Not glamorous, not perfect, but functional enough to allow families to continue, communities to form, children to grow up with roofs over their heads, and futures worth building toward. Jean Harper died in 1995, having spent most of her post-war life in that Dagenham prefab that was supposed to last 10 years but held her family for 32. Her children and grandchildren remembered her there, in the aluminum house with the fitted kitchen and the small garden. The place that had been temporary but became home through decades of living and loving and simply being family within metal walls that weren't ideal but were sufficient. That sufficiency, achieved under difficult circumstances, maintained through determination and care, was its own form of victory, unglamorous, imperfect, but real and lasting in ways the aluminum itself could never be.